evening. Welcome to the big story. I'm Regina Lay.
I'm Gretchen Ho.
And I'm Shawn Yao.
Tonight's big stories. The House Quad Committee zeroes in on former President Duterte's intelligence funds and how it could have potentially been used to reward police officers who killed drug suspects.
Lawmakers ask police to step up the hunt for the Roque couple, even as the Bureau of Immigration confirms that Harry Roque's wife, Myla, has left the country.
And another aggression at sea. The Bureau of Fisheries says that a Chinese militia vessel recently sideswiped one of their boats near Pag-asa Island in Palawan.
Did former President Rodrigo Duterte use his intelligence funds as reward money for the drug killings? That is the question that the House Quad Committee is now zeroing in on.
That comes after former police Colonel Regina Lay dropped a bombshell at last week's hearing, claiming that it was Duterte himself who ordered that the so-called Davao model be replicated nationwide. Even former Senator Ping Lacson told One News he has long heard of this reward system.
And as such, the House Committee is now inviting the former president and his closest allies, former Senators Bongo or current Senators Bongo and Bato de la Rosa, to the next hearing. Mobile journalist Kyla Macantan has tonight's big story.
The House Quad Committee isn't done yet. It now wants to look into whether the Duterte drug war was funded by the Office of the President's Intelligence Funds. That's on the back of former Cebu City Police Chief and ex-PCSO Chair Regina Ley's bombshell revelations last week, wherein she claimed Duterte ordered to replicate the so-called Davao model on a national scale back in 2016. Garma also said there was a reward system for PNP officers who can kill those linked to the illegal drug trade. COCHA Representative Dan Fernandez suspects the reward money came from the President's secret fund.
So sa Malacanang ang pondo at operation to ng police. So manggagaling to sa Intel. There are operations being implemented by the administration or former administration o kahit ngayong administration na kapag police operation o kaya military operation, gagamit ka ng Intel fund. So we need to find out saan talaga kinuha yung pera. And we're pretty sure do yun.
Fernandez admits that tracking down these intel funds will be difficult, as was evident in the deliberations for VP Sara Duterte's own budget. Confidential and intelligence funds do not undergo the usual liquidation and auditing process. But Fernandez believes there's a workaround. He says they just need to find out when the bulk of the money was released. And they will be needing the help of the Commission on Audit for this.
Especially doon sa panahon na alam mo yung panahon ng may pinatay ng mga Chinese doon sa Davao di ba? Yung tatlo. Baka doon nanggaling, hindi mo yung moment na tinransfer yung pera, paring doon makita. Yun yung mga titingnan natin sa Quadcom.
Among past presidents, Duterte had the biggest share in confidential and intelligence funds. In 2021, a year before his term ended, Digong finished off his entire allocation of 4.5 billion pesos. In a joint statement together with Fernandez, the other Quad Committee chairs, Congressman Ace Barbers and Benny Abante said the evidence they've unearthed shows that the reward system did exist, belying Senators Bongo and Bato de la Rosa's denials. In response, Duterte's former chief legal counsel, Attorney Sal Panelo, said one cannot launch a successful war on drugs without an effective legal strategy to neutralize the drug cartel and organized crime, which necessarily will involve funding from the government. The premise is that there was a reward money, no such animal, so the basis for the legislative inquiry does not exist. But in an interview on One News sa Totoo Lang, former Senator Ping Lacson said they've long heard of an incentive scheme.
Unang-una, talagang matagal na namin naririnig na mayroong mga incentives, mga reward, na kung makapatay o kaya makahuli, lalo kung na mga top level, yung sa level 1, medyo mababa hanggang level 4, pataas ng pataas. Ang nakasama kasi rito, pagka mayroong reward, nagiging over-eager yung ating mga kapulisan. At minsan, nauwi na sa personalan. At kung hindi man, pinipilit na maka-score na sa ganon, makakuha ng reward money. Yun na rin yung sinabi ni General Garma na parang pardon the word, pero na parang na-prostitute na yung kalakaran sa operation laban sa droga.
The House Quad Committee has invited Duterte, De La Rosa, and Go to the next hearing on extrajudicial killings. De La Rosa has said he is never attending the inquiry. Go, for his part, is willing to make himself available for the Quadcom. Go even floated the possibility of a parallel investigation at the Senate on the drug war, saying he can be the one to file resolution on this. As for ex-President Duterte, he said he may attend if congressmen ask quote-unquote educated questions. Mobile journalist Kayla Macantan, we are One News.
Now, the other strand that the Quad Committee has been investigating is, of course, POGOs. And today is actually the deadline for foreign POGO workers to downgrade their working visas. And the Bureau of Immigration says that over 12,000 have already complied. Gio Robles with the report.
Today marks the government's deadline for foreign POGO workers to voluntarily downgrade their work visas. Downgrading means converting their working visa permits to temporary tourist visas. This will allow them to stay only up to 59 days in the country. If they do not comply, they may be deported and placed on a blacklist.
Yung legal po na aalis ng bansa will not be blacklisted, will still have the opportunity to come back to the Philippines for legal reasons. If they have legal, legitimate reasons to go back to the country, then they may do so because they have legally followed our laws and our policies. But yung mga magpapaiwan po na gaya na nasabi ko kanina, matigas ang ulo at hindi sumunod sa mga polisiya ng ating gobyerno, ay sila po ay madideport and mabablacklist.
The Immigration Bureau clarified that the 59 days are not meant for them to tour the country or seek other employment here. Instead, it will be given to them to prepare for their departure. According to Task Force POGO, they have fast-tracked the process to avoid complicating the departure of POGO companies and their employees from the country. They can also hold an implementation day to gather all the requirements and exit clearance.
We make sure that expedited yung proseso natin ng downgrading, and at the same time po, we are encouraging din yung mga kumpanya to avail po ng services ng Bureau and the interagency na magkaroon ng implementation days.
To make things simpler for them, para po, kumbaga, we're trying to break down barriers for them to leave. Kasi pag masyado nating pinahirapan yung proseso at marami po silang dadaanan pa at maraming opisina na kailangan bisitahin, then it provides a barrier or some challenges. Baka hindi na sila sumunod dun sa proseso natin. And just to remind those that fall under this category, the October 15 deadline was set in place para po mag-downgrade into tourist visa. Pag tourist visa na po yung hawak nyo, 59 days na lang ang meron ang isang tao para umalis sa bansa.
BI says as of last count, over 12,000 foreign nationals, most of whom are Chinese, have already downgraded their visas. But at the same time, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, or PAOC, is worried about the splintering of the large POGO hubs into smaller ones. Already, the agency has been targeting more than 100 small illegal gambling operators in the country.
Ang hamon talaga is napakarami hong mga nag-underground. We're having difficulty catching up. Assuming lang po na may matira after December 31. So magtutuloy-tuloy pa rin.
For its part, the Justice Department isn't too worried. It pointed out that these smaller ops won't be profitable and they will all eventually leave.
Hindi na po talaga yan feasible in terms of revenue, in terms of profit for these criminal syndicates. It is no longer worth operating in such small quantities. Kaya sa tingin ho natin, itong change of landscape from a big POGO hub to a smaller one is merely part of their winding down operation dahil ayaw naman po nila na bumalik dun sa kanilang bansa dahil siguro sa tingin nila meron pa silang ibang pwedeng puntahan. But this, I believe, is a kumbaga last-ditch effort na gumawa ng konting pera para lang pampalipas, para pag lumipat na sila, at least meron pa rin silang bit-bit na kahit konti. But this does not mean that the IACAT will let up in its efforts.
For News 5, Gio Robles, we are One News.
One person of interest in the Quadcom hearings who has been confirmed to have left the country is Myla Roque, wife of former palace spokesman, Attorney Harry Roque.
Sa ating sala, sinamite rin po natin ito sa mga lawmakers po natin. Si Ms. Myla Roque po is out of the country since September 3. Her Lookout Bulletin was issued on September 16, so wala po siya sa bansa sa kasalukuyan. While former spokesperson Harry Roque has no recent departure as per our records, and meron po siyang Immigration Lookout Bulletin which was issued on August 6.
Myla has an outstanding arrest order from the Quadcom after she repeatedly snubbed the hearings. And that arrest order was issued only on October 11, and again, she left the country on September 3. Her husband Harry likewise has a standing arrest order, but has no recent record of departure from the Philippines for now. The two have been wanted at the hearings to explain the connections between their family company Biancham Holdings and the POGO complex raided in Pampanga. Lawmakers have been questioning how the Roque family's assets jumped from 125,000 pesos in 2016 to as much as 125 million pesos 2 years later. Roque has been in hiding since mid-September, though he continues to post online criticizing Congress. Quad Committee Co-Chairman Dan Fernandez slammed the PNP for their inability to locate Harry for many weeks now.
Nga sabi nga namin, mahiya naman kayo dahil hindi nyo makita si Secretary Harry Roque. Medyo nakakalungkot on the part of the PNP.
What we can give right now is our commitment na hindi po natin natatantanan yung paghahanap.
Let's move on over to the West Philippine Sea, where there has been another incident. BFAR reported that the Chinese maritime militia vessel harassed two of their vessels while they were carrying out routine maritime patrol near Pag-asa Island in Palawan. Carrie Cater has the details.
A video from the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources captured a Chinese maritime militia sideswiping a BFAR ship. The Filipino vessel was conducting patrol near K4 in Pag-asa Island, which is the largest of 9 features occupied by the Philippines in the Spratly Islands. According to BFAR, at around 7:45 a.m. on Friday, October 11, the Chinese vessel deliberately sideswiped the BRP Datu Cabaylo while it was approaching one of the sandbars near Pag-asa Island along with the BRP Datu Sanday. The Chinese boat then chased and tried to block the route of the BFAR vessels, causing another collision and scratches on the latter. It also sustained dents on its starboard but remained operational. Despite China's harassment, BFAR said it completed its mission and both ships have now safely docked at the Pag-asa sheltered port. Pag-asa Island, part of the Spratly Islands in the West Philippine Sea, falls under the municipality of Kalayaan, Palawan. China has long sought to claim this area, which it calls Zhongye, but the 2016 arbitral ruling invalidated their 9-line claim in the South China Sea. China has earlier said they also want to resolve the dispute over the contested territories. But Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro countered, saying China's actions do not match their words.
Committed din tayo sa dialogue basta alam natin hindi tayo niloloko. Hindi tayo sinasaktan, hindi tayo niloloko. So committed talaga sila sa dialogue pero committed din sila sa illegal action.
Recently, President Bongbong Marcos appealed to his fellow leaders at the ASEAN Summit to accelerate the formulation of a code of conduct in the South China Sea to ease tensions in the region. China also promised to help in its formulation. The idea of a code of conduct was first agreed upon as far back as 2002, but the formal process of creating one did not start until 2017. One of the sticking points is whether or not the code will be legally binding. During the ASEAN Summit last week, Marcos voiced frustration that the bloc's 10 member nations cannot even agree on simple things, even a concept as basic as self-restraint. For News 5 Carrie Cator, we are One News.
Call it coincidence, but the Philippines and the United States commenced its annual Kamandag military exercises today, on the same day that Taiwan reported a record number of Chinese warplanes doing large-scale military exercises near them. Philippine Marine Corps Commandant Major General Arturo Rojas stressed during the opening ceremony that the Kamandag drills had long been planned and had nothing to do with what was happening or what is happening in the region. His counterpart with the U.S. Marines also said that the focus of the exercises is to prepare the United States and its allies to respond to any crisis or contingencies. Part of this year's exercises will be live fire drills and other activities in waters between Luzon and Taiwan, as well as sea drills off Palawan, which is facing disputed areas in the West Philippine Sea.
It has nothing to do with whatever is happening in the region. It is not directed to any of those. We're just doing all these things for us as a military force to be able to respond to any crisis.
This exercise, regardless of what's going on geopolitically, is going to happen, and it's to benefit really the Philippine Marine Corps, our partners and allies in the region, to come together to get better, to respond to anything.
Joining this year's exercises are members of Australian, British, Japanese, and South Korean forces and observers from 3 other nations, including France, Thailand, and Indonesia. Around 1,150 AFP members and 1,072 U.S. Marines are expected to take part.
Over in the Middle East, where there's actually all-out war, arrangements are being made to repatriate hundreds of Filipino workers in Lebanon. The Department of Migrant Workers reported that at least 488 OFWs have been brought home safely. At the start of October, Israeli troops crossed the border to Lebanon and launched a full ground invasion, causing extensive damage. The incursions, meant to stamp out Hezbollah, were marked by heavy artillery and airstrikes, leaving entire villages decimated. The DMW says some 250 more Filipinos are awaiting clearance from Lebanese authorities to leave the country. DMW Secretary Hans Kakdak says they're also making provisions for shelters to house those affected.
As soon as they're cleared from Lebanese immigration, we will book them on flight. Meron din tayong shelters. Pinag-utos ng ating Pangulo, bukod dun sa safe repatriation, ay yung magtalaga ng mga kaparaanan kung saan mabibigyan ng tulong at proteksyon yung mga kababayan natin. So may 4 tayong shelters actually. 3 pa lamang ang nalalagyan ng stayers. So doon sa shelters natin na 3, 186 naman ang naroroon. 186. So sa shelters natin, merong doktor, merong social worker, merong nurse.
We're going to be going on a quick break, but right after that, we will be having a chat with retired global investment banker and columnist Stephen Kunying on the coming election season and its impact on the local economy. Keep it here on One News.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Story here on One News.
Former Senator Ping Lacson says it was the administration coalition's campaign manager who finally convinced him to run again. In an interview just this evening with Sa Totoo Lang on 1PH, Lacson said Congressman Toby Tiangco was relentless in calling him to join the Alianza para sa Bagong Pilipinas' senatorial ticket. There was a lot of back and forth between the two that happened only the night before President Bongbong Marcos actually announced the slate on September 26. Earlier, Lacson said his 2022 running mate Tito Soto was also instrumental in his decision to seek another term at the upper chamber.
Yung pala si Congressman Toby Tiangco. Hindi ko alam noon na siya pala yung campaign manager ng administrate nung alliance ng mga political parties. Sabi niya, Senator Ping, baka naman pwedeng mag-reconsider kasi mag-a-announce si Presidente. Sinabi ko rin sa kanya yung dahilan kung bakit atubili ako. Ang sabi niya, hindi, basta hintayin ka namin.
So what to make of next year's roster of candidates so far? For some insights, let me bring in retired global investment banker and columnist Stephen Kunying. Stevie, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Oh, yeah, I said
Inviting me again.
I said retired, huh? Because I know because I know you're
Sometimes it's more tired than retired, but either way, thank you for inviting me.
more tired than retired. Let's start with politics. I'm sure you followed COC filing week. What did you make of the current roster of candidates so far?
I don't think there'll be any change in governance. My view is there is relatively a consensus on how to govern. It's the execution, it's not the policy. And if you go back to every administration since basically at least the second President Aquino, the administration slate in the midterm elections, at least for the Senate, generally wins a big majority, usually 8 to 9, sometimes in Duterte's all 12. So I think one should not expect a change, basically because the infrastructure supporting the administration candidates is very overwhelming at the national level. So it will be, in my view, more continuity, whatever your view of that is, that's the likely scenario.
So it doesn't matter that that there seem to be more families joining the races, the local races at least next year. It doesn't matter that there's now vloggers and influencers also trying to win seats. It doesn't change the landscape, you think?
Well, it's a different mode of the same type of candidates. I mean, are we having families coalescing and adding slates for the first time or replacing other family members? No. Did we have actors and media people who are of some prominence winning? Yes. Is this changing? No. Maybe it's some change in degree, some change in names, but not change in type. So you can say that's unfortunate, but that is reality that's been going on primarily for the last 20 plus years.
Okay, I do agree with what you're saying, and I think pretty much everyone will not argue with you on that. But I want to know if you have noticed anything particularly different going into the midterm elections this time around. Is there anything, good or bad, that is particularly...
Well, okay, I don't want to make judgment calls because I'm generally not happy that the quality of our candidates are based on popularity rather than achievement. But that's nothing new, all right? So at least in several polls, and that there are family dynasties that tend to rule regions or at least provinces or cities. Is that lamentable? You can argue yes, I would probably agree with you, but it's not something new. It's a continuation of an existing trend. And does it mean there'll be changes? Probably not. Do we need changes? Yes. I mean, I have always complained about our lack of critical thinking, and basically, like, I've always been railing about our lack of industrial policy and our slavish adherence to the Washington Consensus, even though the Washington Consensus has never really been followed by the people advocating it in the US and Europe. Look at what happened in 2008 when they had their crisis. They did the opposite of what they told Latin America to do in the 80s, and Asia and the Philippines, unfortunately, was in both the Latin American crisis and the Asian crisis. We were swept up both times, and they did the opposite of what they told us to do. So I think it's time for deeper thinking, updated thinking, and more important, nuanced thinking of what we need to do, because we keep adding our population by 2 million a year. We are not creating quality jobs for that. Our solution is to export people. And that is not, in my view, sustainable. And even if it is, it does not lead to transformational progress. Every manufacturing job on average creates 5 new jobs. That is the multiplier effect. An OFW creates no new jobs. He basically very valiantly and with much difficulty supports his family and his extended group back home. But it doesn't create new jobs.
I want to know your thoughts on the party list system, because that is also, a a prominent theme, a backdoor to Philippine politics, as you may, and how it is being bastardized, but on the other hand, it has also produced congressmen and congresswomen who have been effective in the hearings. For example, from Akbayan, from Kabataan Partylist Bayan Muna, we've seen strong candidates from their side, but also, to quote the former Senator Tito Soto, he said na marami na raw kontratista na ito yung ginagawang paraan para makapasok sila. I mean, talk about business interests at play here. I mean, what does that do, or how does that change the political landscape, the partylist system?
Well, to quote Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Yes, it's both. I'm happy for the big thinkers who are trying to move certain social, political, and economic issues forward. And I'm sad that the party list system is increasingly become another way for, let's just say, the political elite to continue their hold. So it's both. But the trend seems to be moving towards the not so beneficial trend, which is unfortunate.
Okay. And all that demands for change. And when you say that we need to change, I think pretty much everyone will agree with you. Nobody will disagree with you. But where do you see this change coming from? Because traditionally they will say it should be the middle class, right, who will always rally. And when you look at all the EDSAs before, the two or three EDSAs, if you may, it was the middle class who marched there. Are we inclined to do this again, or even that has to change?
Well, first, I agree with you completely that it's usually the middle class. If you even look at revolutions around the world, it's usually the intelligentsia in the middle class who feel their opportunities are being unfortunately restrained for reasons that are beyond merit, who do this. Now, one of the reasons I think we have not had a upheaval is because the tension is dissipated by many of them leaving to find employment. And you can't march when you're elsewhere in the world. So and also if they're providing a economic and social safety net at much personal cost to their family members back home, they're sort of less inclined to pick up the cudgels. But getting to the changes, maybe we can talk about that on economics, but my biggest hope first is for critical thinking. Clearly, the policies we've been following since basically the first President Marcos left and the crisis that engulfed the 80s, and for both administrations, the Marcos and the first President Marcos and the first President Aquino, what the policies we followed in the aftermath of both of that have led to growth, but at a discount and at a slower pace than our larger neighbors, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. So we need to have a new direction. And my hope is everything in this country seems to be political. In other countries, like you look at Korea and Taiwan, they even have martial arts fights in the legislature. So you can't tell me they don't feel very passionate about their political differences. The difference for me, in my observation, is that many issues are considered consensus issues. Education, healthcare, food security, more jobs, industrial policy. Those are not controversial decisions which are changed administration to administration. They are basically a consensus that continues. And they have big fights over everything else, but those key parts of the economy and of the social system continue regardless. And I wish we could move to that direction. Like, do we think it's a political issue to have quality education, to stop malnutrition, to provide decent infrastructure? I would think, and then have an industrial policy to create quality manufacturing jobs. And that's a complex issue. That's not easy. That is something that should go beyond any administration. It should be a consensus. Let me give you the simplest, most successful example, which is taught in many schools in the US, the interstate public highway system. In the 1930s, when he was still a colonel, then Colonel Eisenhower was told, transport a whole armored troop from the East Coast to the West Coast, just in case we have to move troops and material elsewhere. It took him a few weeks. He was aghast at how actually bad quality infrastructure was in the US then. When he won as president in 1952, he decided to start the interstate highway system. So what happened was what was called the flyover states, which were the prairie states and the South, all had quality infrastructure. It has now been 70 years since that started. There have been Republican administrations, Democrat administrations, liberals, conservatives, moderates. That continues regardless. It is a non-controversial policy that has benefited the US greatly. And many other countries, Japan, Korea, Germany, France, followed it. Shouldn't things like that be a consensus for us that doesn't change regardless of which administration is in charge?
We fully agree with you. We also don't know the answer. But that brings me to my next question about term limits. You wrote a column recently on the Manila Times where you argued that term limits have failed in practice. It hasn't led to a higher quality of elected officials. Talk us through that.
Well, my view is I see the point and the principle behind the framers of the 1987 Constitution putting term limits. What was it? To prevent dynasties and to keep, let's just say, unqualified people who have a strong political base from perpetuating itself. Did it work? It didn't. So let's just accept reality. And I would rather if some good legislators win or elected officials, governors, mayors, whatever, I'd rather have a chance to keep them rather than term limited out, given how small the odds are already of excellent people continuing to win. So let's help the few who can win. Now, I understand the view on the presidency, which is because of previous history, we're worried about, given how powerful our presidents become in practice, regardless of what was written in the Constitution in 1987, which substantially weakened the powers of the president vis-a-vis the 1973 Constitution and even the 1935. So I can see their point about term limits for the president. But even then, you look at what Latin America did. They moved Peru, Chile, and Argentina and Brazil went from 1 6-year term to 2 4-year terms. And after that, you have to stop. But after another term, you can come back. That's why Lula in Brazil is on his 3rd term. So you can put a limit so that you can basically say the guy cannot keep perpetuating himself. But after a gap, if he's really that much better than his successor and he's still in good health and he's interested, why not let him run again, him or her?
Wait, so are you for longer terms, or are you for banning them from running again after several consecutive terms? What is your proposal?
I have an open mind. My proposal, like all proposals, like when we discuss economic provisions, is can we think about it? Can we study it? Can we analyze what other countries have done? Can we analyze our situation and then have a robust discussion? And then let us have a right, if not a right decision, a proper decision that's ventilated rather than somebody wakes up in the morning and decides, I want to do this, and then we do it or we don't. Again, critical thinking and analysis. And you know what? If we make a change and it's wrong, then change it again. One of the key points of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was experimentation, because there was a depression and a crisis. And they said, if it doesn't work, we'll change to something else. But let's not just have a fossilized, tight structure that is incapable of adoption.
We're kind of having...
It's a very interesting discussion on term limits, but we do have to go for a quick break right now. So Don't go away. We'll circle back to it after this.
Thank you.
The big Welcome back. You are still watching the big story here on One News.
President Bongbong Marcos called on countries in the Asia-Pacific region to ramp up the implementation of disaster risk reduction protocols. In his speech at the 2024 Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which is being held in Manila for the first time, Marcos stressed the need to increase investments, develop financing mechanisms, and ensure inclusivity to reduce disaster risk. Marcos also said that in accepting the role as steward of the Loss and Damage Fund Board, the Philippines remains committed to managing the fund well to help vulnerable countries deal with the impact of climate change.
We must significantly increase our investments and develop financing mechanisms in disaster risk reduction. Sustained and predictable data and financing would help address disaster risk better. This entails ensuring that developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, landlocked countries, and small island developing states are provided greater access to these resources to advance their policies and build disaster resilience.
Okay, let's circle back to our guest for tonight. We were talking to retired global investment banker and columnist Stephen Gunyeng. Steve, where are you? I can't see you on the screen. Okay, there you are. Okay, so circling back to the debate over term limits, again, your thesis being that they haven't worked as they should, but then also the idea, if you take away that guardrail, then it also opens up the gates to abuse of power, doesn't it?
Well, let's start with the presidency and the other positions. In the other positions, because the presidency has an absolute 6-year term, and I can see why you don't want at least consecutive terms for the same president. I completely understand that position. But let's look at below that. Senators, governors, mayors, congressmen. Has term limits worked? They've just, in the old days, I was 13 years old when martial law was declared in 1973, but you had basically one person who would basically be mayor and governor for until he retired or something. And then if he was really lousy, he could lose. But has it really stopped dynasties? No, you've just expanded it to their family. When before you had one person, now you have one family. And all the members become politicians. So it hasn't worked.
Yeah. And then eventually,
Now,
there are
at the
too
same
many
time-
and they start fighting, right? But it also is, I think, I wanted to put it in this conversation while you're answering Regina's question, because we seem to be allergic also to changing our constitution. And I think that kind of plays a part in this whole thing. How do we, if we're talking about so much change and we can't even change the constitution, which apparently was meant for a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, then where does that leave us?
I agree with you. It's very hard to change, and it was frankly not very carefully thought out when everything was written towards parliamentary in the last minute. They changed to presidential and 2 houses, okay? So what are we supposed to do? Not change it because it's hard? Or try harder to change it and maybe, let's have a consensus on at least some changes first, and then maybe it will allow, if they work out well, further changes. We don't have to have all the changes in one go. And maybe the Supreme Court maybe is overdue to decide how the Senate and the House are supposed to vote. Let's settle that. The Supreme Court hasn't settled it. And then whatever the Supreme Court decides, then let's try to get changes that are appropriate for that. But it reminds me of what Kennedy said when he was talking about putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which was achieved in 1969. He said, we do this not because it was easy, but because it is hard. hard things are normally the important things that need to get done. While I would say there was another thing I saw on Amazon or something where it was a funny comment, which I think maybe we follow. We do this not because it was easy, but because we thought it was easy.
Okay, we're running out of time, but we do need to talk about the economy. Inflation, Steve. Surely you're happy about the fact that we're now at 1.9% as of September, or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm very happy. My only worry is because we import so much and we export people, besides some raw materials, minerals, and things like that, our inflation, compared to most other of countries who are our neighbors, has a higher quota of imported inflation, which means I'm not talking just about energy prices, oil and coal and things like that. Even food prices, manufactured good prices, a higher percentage is imported than our neighbors. So therefore, a lot of our inflation is what is called imported inflation. It is inflation that any government will not have control over. If this is the cost to import something, it is not something we can negotiate except on the margins. So if global or regional inflation is low for what we import, we will have low inflation. If it's high, we can complain all we want, but we can't do anything about it, which is why I think we need industrial policy to start manufacturing more goods.
Fuel prices are rising. What do you see over in the Middle East? Will that prolong? Are we going to expect more of those prices to rise in the coming months?
Well, again, I think the next month will be critical to see whether the Middle East becomes a localized, but right now it's been expanding. It was basically in Palestine. Now there's things in Lebanon. Now Iran and Israel are saber rattling. I'm not going to comment on who's at fault and who's not at fault, but if it becomes broader, let's not forget what started the first big inflation boom post-war. It was the 1973 Middle East War, which the Arab states then had an oil embargo. What's the most recent? It was Russia invading Ukraine because it halted natural gas exports of Russia to Western Europe, and the Ukraine is one of the largest wheat exporters. So yes, that's my point about. Now, if you had food security, you could have some buffers. But if you're importing nearly everything we eat to some percentage, then how can you buffer that?
Yeah, definitely. We're at the mercy of other states who do export their
Exactly.
food. But
It's imported inflation.
right. But I wanted to ask you about, you kept mentioning industrial policy. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Stevie, but the last time we kind of had any sort of industrial policy was under the first Marcos administration. Of course, we know how that ended. It ended up in cronies controlling.
Yes.
And arguably, perhaps, the oligarchy we find ourselves in now. What are you seeing here in terms of how we can rebuild our industrial policy without, a vision of one person?
Okay, let me give you first a two-part answer. The first is, so if we did it wrong the first time in implementation, does it mean the policy was wrong or the execution was wrong? If it was the latter, then why should you abandon the policy rather than improve the execution? That's number one. Getting back to what I said about Kennedy, we do this not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Hard things are important. Number two is, yes, we've learned our lesson from the first time, and we may have to learn it again, but other countries also had corruption issues, also had things, and they reversed it or improved it. In the 1997 crisis, the more practical of our neighbors chose some middle ground rather than like what, frankly, Indonesia and the Philippines did, which was, sige, let's just open it up completely and let's see what happens. What did people like Thailand and Malaysia do? Cement prices are more expensive in the Philippines and Indonesia because they're almost completely foreign-owned. What did Thailand do? The biggest, they said, we can't protect the other cement companies, but we will protect, and the Crown Property Bureau put a lot of money into Siam Cement. And so they said, we will keep the number one Thai-owned. And now Siam Cement has expanded to chemicals, to petrochemicals, to certain industrial goods, whilst remaining the #1 cement company to provide a buffer. So they act as a check because they have lower costs. They don't have to repatriate capital abroad. They can reinvest more and so on. And it has worked out well. So they opened it up to foreign investment, but they kept a safety valve by making the #1 stay tight. And Malaysia did similar things. So it's not an all or nothing. That's why I said critical thinking and adapting to the particulars of one situation. You don't have to go back to what happened in the 1970s, but you don't have to basically say no more policy, no more manufacturing, just export people.
Yeah.
There's some nuance.
When you look at the pre-election surveys, inflation remains the #1 concern of voters. I mean, underscoring the fact that this administration campaigned on the issue of food security, right? Who can forget the 21 peso a kilo rice promise? Do you get the general sense that the Marcos administration is doing enough to get us there?
I think it's a work in progress. I am happy that at least this administration recognizes food security rather than 115 million and rising by 2 million a year can import its way to food security. I think Bertrand Russell was the one who said, I've never seen a nation starved into democracy. I'm not sure if it's him, but that's a famous line. You know, what provides economic and social peace? If nobody's starving, that helps a lot. It helps with education. It helps with social peace. It helps with worker productivity. Now, you look at most countries, the whole European Union, the US, Japan, Korea, they subsidize their farmers to run surpluses, even if it costs them, because all the benefits that comes from food security is better. You go to Hong Kong, you go to the supermarkets, the chicken is from France. Because they're just exporting at a loss their excess production. But there is nobody starving and there's nobody hungry in Japan, Korea, the European Union, and the US.
Why do you think nobody is investing in our food security? I would imagine this would be great business. Is it?
Okay, two reasons for me. One is we slavishly believe in the Washington Consensus. Number two, I'll be very, very blunt. Overpopulation. I'm 65 years old. There's about 115 million Filipinos now. You guess how many Filipinos there were when I was born in 1959? Guess.
20 million, maybe?
Yeah, 19 million. We have grown 600% almost in my lifetime. If China's population grew the same way as us, instead of 1.4 billion people, there would be 3.4 billion Chinese. You think they would have had their economic growth and their prosperity with 3.4 billion mouths to feed?
Steven, speaking of China and the economy, I'm just wondering what has happened now to, or how has the economy reacted to the all-out ban on POGOs? What have you noticed with the real estate industry, with office space industry, with how it has affected the growth of our economy?
It's a sugar high. POGOs became a sugar high. It artificially created demand that is now coming back to reality, and maybe people overbuilt. And you probably need time to work it out of the system. I'm on the board of a publicly listed real estate company, and they said the supply of apartments is something like 2 to 3 years supply. So, you know, I mean, sometimes you make mistakes and you have to deal with it rather than say what? Continue what is not a good or sustainable business.
Meaning there's an oversupply now.
Consequences.
There's an oversupply now because of these POGO companies vacating the industry. Is that part of it?
I mean, I sit on some boards, and when they renew their leases for like the bank branches or the supermarkets and everything, generally they're all still lower than pre-2019. I read in the papers this week that for the first time, rents in BGC have approached what they were before COVID, which means elsewhere they haven't.
But still a bit inflated in BGC, I can attest to that.
And with lots of abandoned cars in parking lots.
Quite a bit of oversupply still. We're going to have to leave that there for tonight. Thank you so much for your insights. We hope you could join us in studio next time. That was retired global investment banker and columnist Steven Cunhing.
Okay, just before we say goodbye, here is our big picture tonight. Speaking of POGOs, this is one of the hubs, which is supposedly owned by captured POGO boss Lin Sun-han. Just days after he was arrested, PAOK raided this alleged scam hub in Laguna. But operatives found the hub already abandoned. There were still equipment and computers left inside, but all hard drives were gone. So I guess it raises a question again, were they given advanced warning? Just like Lucky South, when the PAOK got there, they only caught like a few people who were trying to run away.
The last leak daw, hinahanap nila kung sino yung leak. But I guess we'll be seeing more of that in the months to come, with the deadline being December
31.
And Steve, it was a nice way to put it. POGOs as a sugar high for the real estate, well, for the general economy, right? You're right. He was right. It caused a lot of optimism and bullishness in the economy, but actually they weren't meant to be here forever, right? We should have invested in more stable sources of revenue, like the BPOs, right?
Or the industries that Stevie was talking about.
Manufacturing, but we know there are problems in manufacturing with the power costs to begin with. But
even
that's
raw materials.
More long and raw materials and the supply chain. But that's more for the long term. But in the meantime, like when you think about it, the POGOs came in, they inflated real estate prices for a time, and now look, 4 years later, 5 years later, they're out, right?
And we're back.
It's caused quite a disruption in the real estate prices.
That is the effect on the economy. I wonder what would the effect be on elections, on election spending.
There was even rumors that some of the POGO money was being funneled into election campaigns, right?
So I guess we'll find out. Elections just around the corner. But we have run out of time. That's it for the big story tonight.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.